Chapter 1: Suspicion. In the maximum security prison of Maine, different people worked. Prison warden Robert "Bob" Carson, 42 years old, always prided himself on his impeccable reputation and devotion to duty. 15 years of faultless service taught him to notice the smallest details in the behavior of both prisoners and staff. His wife, Emily, 35 years old, worked as a nurse in the same prison. No one could have imagined that she would be the cause of events that would forever change the lives of several people, including inmate Michael Taylor, a wrongly convicted financier, and Tony Ramirez, who dreamed of only one thing: seeing his dying mother. Bob noticed changes in Emily's behavior at the beginning of July, when the summer heat turned the prison corridors into a scorching oven. She became distracted, often lingered late in the medical unit, although she used to rush home immediately after her shift. At first, he attributed this to fatigue. Working in the prison hospital was never easy, but something in her behavior made him tense up inside. Maybe it was the way she avoided his gaze at dinner, or how she flinched at his touch. That morning, Bob decided to check the medical unit's logbook. He leafed through the pages of the medical journal when his attention was drawn to a strange pattern. Inmate Michael Taylor, serving a 25-year sentence for financial fraud, began appearing in the medical unit almost every day. Either a headache or problems with blood pressure or insomnia. The diagnoses were vague and indefinite. But before that, Taylor, as Bob remembered, was in excellent health. Something was wrong here, especially considering that all these visits fell precisely during Emily's shifts. Carson put aside the journal and began methodically observing his wife during her shifts. She seemed to glow from within with some new, unfamiliar energy. When Taylor appeared in the medical unit, her movements became smoother, her voice softer. A special tension arose between them, which an experienced jailer could not fail to notice. Bob had seen enough intrigue in his career to understand something serious was happening. On the same day, but in another wing of the prison, Warden Frank Mackenzie was meeting with inmate Tony Ramirez in his spacious office. The warden's office contrasted sharply with the rest of the premises. The air conditioner was running at full capacity, creating a pleasant coolness, and heavy curtains protected from the scorching sun. Behind a massive oak desk sat Mackenzie himself, a stout man of 55, with bald spots and a cold, assessing gaze. He carefully studied the personal file of the inmate sitting opposite him. Tony Ramirez, a 40-year-old Latino with sad eyes, sat with his head bowed. His tanned hands with swollen veins rested on his knees. 25 years for armed robbery, such was the price of his desperate attempt to find money for his mother's treatment. Now, 5 years into his imprisonment, he received word that her condition was critical. Doctors gave her a month at most. "I've reviewed your file, Ramirez," Mackenzie began, setting the folder aside. "You have a good record, no violations in 5 years, work in the laundry, regularly attend church." He paused, carefully observing the inmate's reaction. "How's your mother?" At the mention of his mother, Ramirez winced and raised his eyes. Pain was visible in them. "She's dying, sir. The doctors say there's very little time left." Mackenzie nodded with affected sympathy. "I could help you see her. Moreover, I could cut your sentence in half, for good behavior, of course." He paused again. "But I need a favor in return." Ramirez leaned forward, hope and fear mingled in his gaze. "What kind of favor, sir?" "There's one inmate, Michael Taylor. Know him?" Mackenzie took a photo from a drawer and placed it in front of Ramirez. "I need him to disappear. An accident, suicide, I don't care. The main thing is to do it quietly." Ramirez stared at the photo for a long time, which depicted a middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and a slight half-smile. "Why him?" "That's none of your concern," Mackenzie snapped. "Your concern is to do everything cleanly. In return, you'll get permission to visit your mother and a reduced sentence. Think carefully, another 12.5 years or freedom in a couple of months. The choice is yours." Ramirez was silent for a long time, looking at Taylor's photo. In 15 years of prison life, He had seen a lot murders, fights. But it's one thing to witness violence and quite another to cold-bloodedly plan someone's death. However, he had no choice. The thought that he might never see his mother alive again was unbearable. "I agree," he finally said in a hoarse voice. "Excellent." Mackenzie leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. "Tomorrow you'll be transferred to his cell. The official reason is overcrowding in your block. Get to know him, gain his trust, but don't drag it out too long." The next morning, Tony Ramirez, with a small bag of personal belongings, stood in front of Michael Taylor's cell. The guard opened the bars and Ramirez stepped inside. Taylor sat on the lower bunk, reading a tattered paperback. He looked up at his new cellmate, the calm, assessing gaze of a person accustomed to analyzing situations. "Hello," Taylor said, putting the book aside. "I'm Mike." "Tony," replied Ramirez, throwing the bag on the upper bunk. The cell was small but surprisingly neat. Books lay in a neat stack on the table and photos hung on the wall, apparently family photos. Ramirez involuntarily noted this detail. A person who keeps photos of loved ones in sight either misses them very much or wants others to see his humanity. "Transferred from C Block?" Taylor inquired. "Yes, it's overcrowded there now." Ramirez began to unpack his things, furtively watching his cellmate. He tried to find something in him that would justify Mackenzie's order, but saw only a tired, middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and calm manners. Taylor, meanwhile, got up and went to the wash basin. His movements were unhurried, confident. He clearly felt at home in the cell, a habit developed over years of imprisonment. Splashing water on his face, he wiped himself with a faded towel and turned to Ramirez. "What are you in for, if you don't mind me asking?" "Armed robbery, 25 years," replied Ramirez, sitting down on his bunk. "And you?" "Financial fraud, also 25, Taylor chuckled grimly. "Funny, isn't it? You took less than 10,000 with a gun and I, according to the prosecution, stole millions sitting in an office. And the sentence is the same." Ramirez detected bitterness in his voice. Something told him that Taylor's story was more complicated than it seemed at first glance. He remembered Mackenzie's cold gaze and felt an unpleasant sensation growing inside him, as if he had been made a pawn in someone else's game. The sound of keys came from the corridor. The guard was making his evening rounds. Taylor returned to his book and Ramirez lay down on the bunk, looking at the ceiling. He had to spend a lot of time in this cell, studying the man he was supposed to kill. He closed his eyes, and the emaciated face of his sick mother appeared before his inner eye. "Forgive me, Mom," he whispered with his lips. While Ramirez was settling into his new cell, Bob Carson continued his unofficial observation. During his round, he noticed Emily slipping into the medical unit half an hour before her shift. Through the glass partition, he saw her hurriedly handing something to Taylor. At first glance, ordinary medicines, but something about this gesture seemed strange to him. Too intimate, too cautious. Catching his gaze through the glass, Emily flinched and hastily turned to the medicine cabinet. Taylor, on the contrary, remained completely calm. He thanked the nurse and slowly headed for the exit, as if challenging Bob with his slowness. Passing by the warden, he nodded slightly, as he always did. There was a twinkle in his eyes, either mockery or defiance. After the inmate left, Bob entered the medical unit. Emily was still standing at the cabinet, pretending to be counting medicines. "What did you give him?" he asked, trying to make his voice sound as ordinary as possible. "Sleeping pills," she replied without turning around. "He has trouble sleeping." "Like half the inmates," Bob noted. "Why does he get special attention?" Emily finally turned to him. Irritation was visible in her eyes. "Are you following me? It's my job to keep track of everything that happens in the prison. I work here too, Bob, and I know my responsibilities." Unfamiliar, metallic notes appeared in her voice. She had never spoken to him like that before. Something broke between them, something important and perhaps irreparable. Taylor is not an ordinary inmate, she continued, already softer. He's an educated man, you can talk to him. Besides, I'm sure he's innocent. They all say that, Bob muttered. No, it's different here. I've seen the documents in his case. There are so many inconsistencies. You shouldn't get involved in this, Bob interrupted her. Just do your job. That's exactly what I'm doing, Emily snapped and demonstratively returned to her records. Bob stood for a while longer, looking at her tense back, then silently left. This short skirmish left a bitter taste in his mouth. He felt that he was losing his wife, and that was much more frightening than a possible violation of prison rules. At the end of the corridor, he ran into Mackenzie. The warden looked unusually pleased, as if he had just received good news. "Ah, hello, Carson," he greeted the warden. "How's it going in the medical unit? All quiet?" There was something in his tone that made Bob wary. It seemed that the warden was well aware of what was happening and was watching the development of events with some unhealthy interest. "Everything's fine, sir," replied Bob, looking carefully into Mackenzie's eyes. "That's good," he nodded. "Keep an eye on it, especially on this. Taylor, I think he's plotting something." With these words, Mackenzie left, leaving Bob in even greater confusion. Something was definitely happening in the prison, some big game, and his wife, it seemed, had become its involuntary participant. In the evening of the same day, Taylor and Ramirez were sitting in their cell. Lights out had not yet been announced, and the prison block was buzzing with the muffled voices of inmates. Somewhere in the distance, the consumptive old man Johnson from the neighboring cell coughed convulsively, and the on-duty guard walked along the corridor, jingling a bunch of keys. Taylor sat on his bunk, leaning against the wall and thoughtfully turning some small object in his hands. Ramirez, pretending to read a magazine, furtively watched his cellmate. In the dim light of the prison lamp, he noticed that Taylor was holding a small paper note. "You know, Tony," Taylor suddenly spoke without raising his eyes, "I really am innocent." Ramirez lowered the magazine. Something in his cellmate's voice made him listen. "I was the financial director of a large company," Taylor continued. "One day I discovered that my boss was running fraudulent schemes with the reports. The company was suffering losses, but the documents showed huge profits. He forced me to sign these reports so that the stock price would be incredibly high before the sale of a controlling stake. Naturally, after the deal, an audit showed the real situation and when everything came to light." Taylor fell silent, crumpled the note and hid it in his pocket. "Why didn't you refuse to sign?" Ramirez asked. "He threatened me, not me, my family. I have a wife and 2 children. However, now only children. My wife couldn't stand the shame. She divorced me a year after the verdict." There was no bitterness in Taylor's voice, only fatigue. Ramirez felt something constricting inside him. He remembered Mackenzie's words about the accident and thought that the warden clearly wanted to get rid of Taylor for a reason. "And now I have a chance to prove my innocence," Taylor unexpectedly continued. "I've found documents that can confirm my version. I just need to get out of here, and then I can tear down the whole case." He looked carefully at Ramirez, as if assessing whether he could be trusted. At that moment, footsteps were heard in the corridor. A medical round was approaching the cell. Ramirez saw the familiar figure of Nurse Emily. She stopped at their bars, holding a tray of medicines in her hands. "Good evening, Mr. Taylor." Her voice sounded professional, but Ramirez caught special notes in it. "Your sleeping pill." Taylor approached the bars. Taking the pills, he held the nurse's hand for a moment, so quickly that the guard accompanying the round didn't notice anything. But Ramirez saw something small moving from Taylor's hands into Emily's palm. After the nurse left, Taylor returned to his bunk. He looked calm, but a new glint appeared in his eyes, a glint of hope. "You know what's the worst thing about prison?" he asked suddenly. "Not the bars, not the guards, not the bad food, but the fact that everyone here uses each other. Everyone tries to get something from someone else. Friendship, love, trust, all this turns into small change here. Ramirez felt a chill run down his spine. Taylor's words described his own situation too accurately. He looked at the photos on the wall, smiling children, a happy family, a life that had been taken away from this man. And now Mackenzie wants to take away his last chance for justice. The lights were turned off in the prison corridor. There were only a few minutes left before lights out. Ramirez lay down on his bunk, but sleep didn't come. Before his eyes was the disease-stricken face of his mother, replaced by the faces of Taylor's children in the photos. What's right? He thought. What's really right? At night, Bob Carson couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to Emily's even breathing next to him, and thought about how his life had changed in recent weeks. 20 years of marriage is a long time, but never before had he felt such a gap between them. Every morning she went to work earlier and earlier. Every evening she returned later and later. And now these strange notes, secret glances, a special intonation in her voice when she talks about Taylor. The next morning he came to the prison earlier than usual. The summer sun was only just rising above the horizon, painting the gray prison walls in a pinkish color. At such moments, even this gloomy place seemed almost beautiful. Bob headed straight to the archive. He needed to know more about Taylor's case. The archivist, old Jim Peterson, raised his eyebrows in surprise when he saw the warden at such an early hour. "Something happened, Bob?" "No, I just want to check something. Taylor's case, can you find it?" Peterson slowly got up from his desk and headed to the shelves. After a few minutes, he returned with a thick folder. "A strange case," he said, handing over the documents. "Very strange." Bob settled at a distant table and plunged into reading. Taylor's story turned out to be really unusual. Financial director of a large company, impeccable reputation, charity, 2 children. And then a sudden accusation of fraud with the reports, a lightning-fast trial and a harsh sentence, 25 years. Everything looked strange. Both the speed of the trial and the fact that the main documents proving Taylor's guilt disappeared somewhere immediately after the verdict was pronounced. But Bob was most interested in the figure of the judge who presided over the trial, Frank Holbrook. He was an old friend and golf partner of James Kingsley, Taylor's boss. And 6 months after the verdict, he mysteriously died in a car accident. "Found anything interesting?" Mackenzie's voice made Bob wince. The warden was standing right behind his back, and it was unclear how long he had been there. "I'm studying Taylor's case, sir. I want to better understand the inmates I work with." "Commendable zeal." Mackenzie sat down on the edge of the table. "Just don't dig too deep, Bob. Some secrets are better left buried." There was a clear threat in his voice. Bob slowly closed the folder. "You have a wonderful wife, Bob," Mackenzie continued, looking somewhere into space. "It would be a shame if her reputation suffered because of careless behavior." "What do you mean, sir?" "Nothing special, just a friendly warning. Some things are better left as they are." Mackenzie got up and headed for the exit. At the door, he turned around. "By the way, I heard that your Emily has been spending too much time in the medical unit lately. Maybe she should take a vacation, for her health." When the warden left, Bob sat motionless for a long time, looking at the folder with Taylor's case. Everything added up to a strange picture. A murdered judge missing documents, his wife's sudden interest in the inmate, Mackenzie's threats. Something was wrong here, something much more serious than a banal affair between a nurse and an inmate. In the afternoon, when the summer heat reached its peak, Emily was working in the medical unit, carefully avoiding the gaze of her husband, who was on duty in the corridor. She was sorting through patient cards, but her thoughts were far away. In the pocket of her robe lay a note from Taylor, passed last night. She hadn't had time to read it yet. Too many eyes were watching her every move. The door of the medical unit opened, letting in another inmate. It was Ramirez, Taylor's new cellmate. He complained of a headache, but Emily noticed how carefully he studied her while she was measuring his blood pressure. "The pressure is slightly elevated," she said in a professional tone. "I'll prescribe you pills." While she was writing the prescription, Ramirez unexpectedly spoke in a quiet voice. "He's innocent, you know." Emily's hand trembled, the ink blurred on the form. She looked up at the inmate. "What are you talking about?" "About Taylor. He told me his story, and I believe him." Emily looked back at the door. Bob was standing outside, talking to another guard. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "Because you're the only one who can help him, and because," Ramirez hesitated, "because some people want him to be silenced forever." A chill ran down Emily's spine. She remembered the strange conversation with Mackenzie last week, his hints that some inmates knew too much for their own good. "Here's your prescription," she said loudly, handing over the paper, and added in a whisper, "Meet in the chapel, after the evening service." Ramirez nodded and left. Emily watched him go, noticing how Bob was watching her intently. In his eyes, there was a mixture of suspicion and pain. Left alone, she finally took out Taylor's note. Only a few lines, written in small, neat handwriting. "I have evidence against Kingsley and Mackenzie. They're partners. Mackenzie helped cover up the case and hide the real documents. Copies need to be sent to my lawyer. We don't have much time." Emily felt her heart beat faster. She had long suspected something like that, but the reality turned out to be scarier. If Mackenzie was really involved in this case. She remembered his piercing gaze, how he always appeared unexpectedly, as if watching her every step. Footsteps were heard in the corridor. Someone was approaching the medical unit. Emily hastily burned the note over the sink and washed the ashes with water. When the door opened, she was already sitting at the desk, pretending to be filling out documents. Mackenzie stood on the threshold. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Carson." His voice sounded with feigned politeness. "How's work progressing?" "Everything's fine, sir." "Glad to hear it. By the way, I've noticed that you've been communicating a lot with inmate Taylor lately." Emily tried to make her voice sound indifferent. "He often complains of insomnia. I prescribe him sleeping pills." "Yes, yes, of course," Mackenzie smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "You know, some inmates like to manipulate staff, especially women. They tell heartbreaking stories about their innocence, try to evoke sympathy." "I know my job, sir." "I have no doubt, and yet be careful. It would be regrettable if your professional sympathy led to unpleasant consequences." With these words he left, leaving Emily in a state close to panic. She realized that she had to act quickly. Tonight, in the chapel, she will have to make a decision that will change not only her life, but also the lives of many other people. At the end of the corridor, Mackenzie stopped next to Bob. "Keep an eye on your wife, Carson," he said quietly. "It seems she's forgotten where the line is between compassion and foolishness." Bob was silent, watching the departing warden. Then he turned to the window of the medical unit. Emily was sitting with her head low over the papers. Her shoulders were trembling slightly. For the first time in all his years of service, Bob didn't know how to do the right thing. In a small roadside cafe 20 miles from the prison, Frank Mackenzie met with James Hoffman, Taylor's former boss. They chose the farthest table, away from the few visitors. Hoffman nervously adjusted his tie knot. He was clearly worried about this meeting. "Taylor's plotting something," Mackenzie began without preamble, stirring his cold coffee. "My sources say he has some documents." Hoffman's well-groomed face paled. "What kind of documents? That's impossible. We destroyed all the evidence." "Apparently not all." Mackenzie leaned forward. "He's made contact with the prison nurse. He's using her to transmit information to Freedom if these papers fall into the hands of journalists or the prosecutor's office." "We can't allow that." Hoffman dabbed his forehead with a napkin. "I paid you enough so that such problems wouldn't arise." "That's why I'm here," Mackenzie smirked. "I've already taken certain steps. His new cellmate is a reliable man. Taylor will disappear quickly and quietly. An accident, suicide, choose for yourself. What about the nurse? That's not your concern. I'll take care of everything. Meanwhile, in the prison medical unit, Emily was methodically preparing for Taylor's escape. She had been collecting the necessary medicines for 2 weeks, hiding them in a cache behind a tile in the toilet. She made a list of the necessary documents, thought out the route. Every step was calculated and considered. Emily understood that she was risking not only her career, but also her freedom. However, the more she learned about Taylor's story, the more time she spent with him, the stronger her confidence in the correctness of her actions became. She couldn't allow an innocent person to rot in prison while real criminals enjoyed freedom. Besides, romantic feelings clearly arose between them. Meanwhile, Ramirez was also becoming imbued with the situation and began to understand that he would not be able to kill Taylor. During the 2 weeks of joint stay in the cell, he saw a completely different person in his cellmate, not the criminal that Mackenzie was talking about. In the evenings, they talked for a long time. Taylor talked about his children, about working in a financial company, about how he discovered the fraud of his superiors. There wasn't a drop of falsehood in his words. "You know, Tony," Taylor once said, looking at a photo of his children, "the scariest thing is not that I'm in prison. The scary thing is that they're growing up, considering their father a criminal. I have to prove my innocence for them." Ramirez nodded silently. He thought about his mother who was waiting for him in freedom, dying but waiting. Mackenzie's offer seemed so tempting to kill Taylor, get parole, see his mother. But now this thought only aroused disgust in him. One morning when they were returning from breakfast, Taylor quietly said, "I know why you were put in with me. Mackenzie wants me dead." Ramirez froze in place. "Where? How did you guess?" "I'm not blind, Tony. Besides, I have my own sources of information. Mackenzie and my former boss are old friends. They made millions on those machinations that I discovered, and now they're afraid that the truth will come out." Ramirez sat down on the bunk. "Yes, you're right. He promised to reduce my sentence. My mother is dying, Mike. I just wanted to see her before she died." Taylor put his hand on his shoulder. "I understand, but there's another way. Help me get out of here instead of killing me. I have proof of their crimes out there. If I can get out of prison and pass these documents to the right people, then they won't get away with it." Footsteps were heard in the corridor. It was Nurse Emily with her evening round. Taylor quickly moved to the bars. While the guard was watching the distribution of medicines, Taylor and Emily exchanged barely noticeable nods. Ramirez understood these two had already made some kind of plan, and now he had to decide become their ally or still be a tool in the hands of Mackenzie. That same night, a conversation took place in the cell that changed everything. Taylor convinced Ramirez, revealing all the cards. "I have evidence of their machinations," Taylor whispered. "Genuine documents showing how they manipulated the reports. There are forged contracts and fake invoices here. There are even receipts for the transfer of money. Mackenzie's real name is listed in the recipients. That's why they're so desperate to get rid of me." "How did you manage to keep this?" "I had a copy of all the documents hidden in a safe place. Only I know where they are. Now we just need to get out of prison and hand them over to the right hands." Ramirez shook his head thoughtfully. "And you trust the nurse enough to dedicate her to your escape plan?" "Emily is not like everyone here." A special warmth appeared in Taylor's voice. "She's the only one who really listened to my story. She risks everything by helping me, her career, her freedom. And she does it not for money or gain, but because she believes in justice." "What about her husband, Warden Carson?" "That's the most difficult thing," Taylor sighed. "She loves him, really loves him. But Bob is a man of the system. He believes in rules, in order. For him, there is only black and white, the criminal and the law. He will never understand that sometimes you need to break the rules for the sake of higher justice." Ramirez was silent, thinking about what he had heard. He remembered his mother, her instructions on honesty and decency. "Always do the right thing, son," she said. But what does right mean in a world where honest people are put in prison and criminals walk free? "I'll help you," he finally said. "Tell me what to do." Taylor nodded gratefully. "Tomorrow Emily will bring the last details of the plan. The escape is scheduled for next week. Did Mackenzie say anything to you about the timeline?" "He's getting impatient. He hinted that he wants to see the result in the coming days." "So we don't have much time." Taylor hid the documents back in the cache. "Thank you, Tony. I know what you're risking." "You're risking no less." "Yes, but I have no choice. This is my only chance to see my children and clear my name." Dawn was breaking outside the cell window. A new day brought new challenges, new risks, but both inmates felt an unprecedented relief. Now they were not alone in their struggle for justice. Chapter 3: Choice. Bob Carson hadn't slept for the third night in a row. He lay in bed, listening to Emily's quiet breathing next to him, and tried to overcome the doubts that were tormenting him. 15 years of impeccable service had taught him one thing: there is no place for half-tones in prison. There are inmates and there is the law, and his task is to ensure that a clear boundary is maintained between them. But now this boundary was blurring before his eyes, and the main thing, it was blurring by his own wife. During the day, he watched her working in the medical unit, just as collected and professional as always. But something imperceptibly changed in her movements, in the way she communicated with the inmates, especially with Taylor. Bob noticed these subtle glances, the occasional touches when handing over medicines, the quiet conversations that stopped as soon as he approached. Each such moment echoed with sharp pain somewhere under his ribs. Meanwhile, in another wing of the prison, Mackenzie was running his game. He summoned Ramirez under the pretext of discussing his petition for clemency. In the warden's office, as always, it was cool from the running air conditioner, and heavy curtains did not let in the scorching summer sun. "Well, how's our business progressing?" Mackenzie asked, pouring coffee into cups. He deliberately added friendly notes to his voice, but his eyes remained cold and tenacious. "I'm working on it," replied Ramirez, trying to make his voice sound confident. "Taylor has begun to trust me." "Time is running out." Mackenzie put a cup in front of the inmate. "Your mother is unlikely to last more than a month. It would be a shame if you didn't have time to say goodbye to her." Ramirez felt nauseous. He understood that his every word was being recorded and analyzed, that any wrong intonation could betray his true intentions. He thought about the documents hidden in Taylor's cell, about the escape plan, about his dying mother. Choices flashed before his eyes like frames of an old movie. In the prison medical unit, Emily was preparing for the decisive stage of the escape plan. Everything had to be perfectly calculated. One miscalculation could cost not only freedom, but also life. Her hands trembled slightly when she thought about how she would have to leave certain doors, accidentally, open. She knew the guard's schedule by heart. 15 years of working in the prison had taught her to notice the smallest details in the daily routine. Johnson was on duty on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the most negligent of the guards who often went out for a smoke. On Friday after lunch, the shift changed, an ideal time for a distracting maneuver. And on Sunday, Bob usually took a day off. At the thought of her husband, her heart clenched. She loved him, really loved him, for his honesty, integrity, for how reliable he had always been. But now these same qualities had become a wall between them. How to explain to a person who sacredly believes in the system that sometimes the system makes mistakes, that justice and the law are not always the same thing? Meanwhile, Taylor and Ramirez were sitting in their cell, carefully discussing every detail of the upcoming escape. The plan was risky, but carefully thought out. They had gone over every detail dozens of times, taken into account all possible scenarios. Emily was supposed to leave the right doors open. They already had the prison plan. Now it was a matter of dexterity and speed. "As soon as the documents are with the press," Taylor explained, packing the cramped cell. "There will be no turning back. Mackenzie and my former boss will be under attack. They will have to defend themselves, which means to distract themselves from us." Ramirez sat on the lower bunk, fingering his rosary, a gift from his mother. What if they succeed first? What if Mackenzie suspects something? "That's why we have to act quickly." Taylor sat down next to him. "Emily says tomorrow is the perfect moment. There will be a parole board in the prison commotion, a lot of outsiders. The guards will be distracted." At that moment, Emily passed by in the corridor with her evening round. She lingered at their cell a little longer than usual, pretending to check the appointments in the medical record. "Everything's ready," she whispered, without looking at them. "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, be ready." When her footsteps faded at the end of the corridor, Ramirez turned to Taylor. "If something goes wrong, if we get caught, then we'll all be in very big trouble," Taylor finished for him. "But we have no choice. This is the only chance to restore justice." Ramirez nodded. He thought about his mother, about the fact that he might never see her alive again. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was doing the right thing. In the medical unit, Emily checked the plans for tomorrow one last time. Her hands were trembling. Everything will be decided tomorrow. Either they will carry out what they have planned and help an innocent person gain freedom, or she didn't allow herself to think about another scenario. Suddenly she heard footsteps in the corridor. Her heart skipped a beat. No one should have been in the medical unit at this time. Quickly closing the cabinet, she pretended to be filling out the journal. Her husband Bob appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing here so late?" Bob asked, looking carefully at his wife. In the dim light of the medical unit, his face seemed gaunt and aged. 15 years of service seemed to have appeared in wrinkles on his forehead in these few weeks. Emily felt her heart beating wildly, but outwardly remained calm. "I'm filling out the documentation. There's a commission tomorrow, you know. They always require a full report on the health of the inmates." Bob slowly walked through the medical unit, his gaze sliding over the shelves with medicines over his wife's desk. "I haven't asked you before," he began quietly, "but now I must know. What's going on between you and that inmate Taylor?" She froze. This moment had to come. She had known it from the very beginning. But how to explain to her husband that her actions are dictated not only by romantic feelings, but by a desire for justice? How to tell about the documents, about Mackenzie's machinations, about an innocent man whom the system is grinding in its millstones? "Bob," she looked him straight in the eye, "do you believe in justice?" "I believe in the law," he replied firmly. "What if the law makes a mistake? If the system we serve is used to hide the crimes of those who are supposed to protect justice?" Bob sat down on a chair. He looked incredibly tired. "You're talking like a lawyer, not like my wife. I've seen you with him. I've seen how you look at him, how you pass notes." "It's not what you think." Emily went up to her husband, put her hand on his shoulder. "Taylor is innocent. I have proof. Mackenzie and the people who put him behind bars are the real criminals. And so you decided to become a judge, to take the law into your own hands." There was bitterness in his voice. "No, I decided to help the truth come out. Isn't that what we're here for? Isn't it so that justice triumphs?" Bob raised his eyes to her. "Do you understand that you're risking not only your career, if Mackenzie finds out?" "He already suspects something." Emily sat down next to her husband. "Everything will be decided tomorrow. I should have told you earlier, but I was afraid to put you in such a difficult position. Forgive me." In Mackenzie's office at this time, an emergency meeting was taking place. The warden had received disturbing news from his informant. Something should happen tomorrow. His people had detected suspicious activity around the prison. Some car had driven past the gate several times, and a man resembling Taylor's former lawyer had been seen in the city. "Reinforce security," he ordered his deputy, "especially during the work of the commission. Check everyone entering and leaving, And don't take your eyes off the medical unit. He went to the window, looking at the prison yard, lit by spotlights. Somewhere there, in one of the cells, sat a man capable of destroying everything he had built for years. Taylor with his documents was like a time bomb. And now there was also the nurse and the cellmate to whom he had entrusted the elimination of the problem. Mackenzie took out a folder with Taylor's personal file from the safe. For 15 years he had kept everything under control. For 15 years, this secret had remained buried behind prison walls. He couldn't allow some financier and a sentimental nurse to destroy everything. "Bring Ramirez to me," he ordered, "immediately." Meanwhile, in the medical unit, Bob made the most difficult decision of his life. After listening to his wife's story, seeing the documents she was hiding, he realized the system he had faithfully served for so many years had really failed. The question was not whether his wife was breaking the law. The question was what was more important, the letter of the law or its spirit. "What are you going to do tomorrow?" he asked Emily. "Do you really want to know?" She looked intently at her husband. "Because if I tell you, you will become an accomplice." Bob closed his eyes for a moment. All the years of service, his impeccable reputation, the oath he had taken flashed before his inner eye. And then he saw Taylor's face, the face of a man who had been turned into a criminal by the system, Ramirez's face, ready to risk his only chance to see his mother for the sake of justice, and the face of his wife, a woman who turned out to be braver and more honest than himself. "Tell me everything," he said, "and let's think about how to do it right." Outside the medical unit window, dawn was breaking. Less than 12 hours remained before the start of the commission. Chapter 4: Resolution. The day of the parole board began in the prison as usual, with the morning roll call. But a strange tension hung in the air which everyone felt, both prisoners and guards. Strangers in suits scurried through the corridors, members of the commission, inspectors, lawyers. Mackenzie personally met them at the entrance, radiating the cordiality and confidence of a man who has nothing to hide. Bob Carson started his shift earlier than usual. After the night conversation with Emily, he didn't close his eyes, pondering the plan of action. Now, walking through the familiar corridors, he looked at his work with different eyes. Every cell, every lock, every bar, everything that used to seem like a part of the inviolable system of justice, now seemed like links in the chain that bound an innocent man. In the medical unit, Emily was preparing for the decisive moment. The documents that could ruin Mackenzie's career and free Taylor were securely hidden among the medical records. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a contact was supposed to come, a young lawyer, supposedly checking the conditions of detention of prisoners. He was supposed to take the documents and immediately pass them on to the editorial offices of the largest newspapers in the state. Taylor and Ramirez in their cell were also waiting for the appointed hour. They hardly spoke. Everyone understood that now any careless word could betray their plans. Ramirez fingered his rosary, a gift from his mother, thinking that he might never see her again. Taylor sat on the bunk, looking at the photos of his children. Everything that was to happen today, he did for them, so that they knew that their father was not a criminal. Suddenly, footsteps were heard in the corridor. Someone was quickly approaching their cell. It was a guard sent by Mackenzie. "Ramirez, out. The warden wants to see you." Taylor and Ramirez exchanged quick glances. They both understood Mackenzie suspected something. Now everything depended on whether Ramirez could convince the warden that he was still on his side. In Mackenzie's office, Ramirez felt cold sweat trickle down his back. The warden sat behind his massive desk, shuffling some papers, as if the prisoner's presence didn't interest him at all. Finally, he raised his eyes. "You know, Ramirez, I'm disappointed, very disappointed. I gave you a simple task to remove one inmate. In return, I promised freedom, a chance to see your mother. And you?" He laid out several photos on the table. In them, Ramirez was talking to Taylor in the cell, handing him something, shaking his hand. "And you decided to play at nobility." Ramirez was silent. He understood that his every word could be fatal not only for him, but also for the other participants in the plan. Last chance, Mackenzie leaned forward. Taylor must die today, right now. If you do this, you will get everything I promised. If not, he paused, I'm afraid your mother will never wait for her beloved son. At that moment, Bob Carson entered the office without knocking. His face was inscrutable, but his eyes read the determination of a man ready to go to the end. Sir, we have a problem in the medical unit. It seems your presence is required. Mackenzie rose sharply. What's there? It's better for you to see for yourself. Bob held his breath. His right hand, lying on the holster, trembled slightly. As they walked down the corridor, Ramirez noticed how Bob nodded almost imperceptibly towards the emergency exit, the very one that Emily was supposed to, accidentally, leave open. He understood. The warden had decided to help them. Now it remained only to wait for the right moment. In the medical unit, organized chaos was reigning. Emily managed to start a small fire, dropping an alcohol lamp. Smoke filled the room. The fire alarm went off. The guards assigned to watch her were forced to help evacuate documents and medicines. In the chaos, no one noticed how she handed a package with Taylor's real documents to a young lawyer from the commission, who immediately left the prison building. Mackenzie instantly understood what was happening. His face contorted with rage. All prisoners to their cells. No one is to be released. Carson, you are personally responsible for Taylor. But it was too late. In the conditions of a fire alarm and evacuation of the UDO commission, confusion arose. Inmates lined up along the walls according to protocol. Guards tried to establish order. Members of the commission hurried to the exits. In this confusion, Taylor, who had received a signal from Ramirez, managed to get lost in the crowd. Bob, pretending to look for Taylor at one end of the corridor, deliberately moved in the opposite direction from where the fugitive actually was. He understood that this was the end of his career, perhaps even his freedom, but for the first time in 15 years of service, he felt that he was doing the right thing. Emily, still in the medical unit, tried to maintain the appearance of panic due to the fire. She bustled about, accidentally dropping folders with documents, creating additional confusion. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed how Taylor, having changed his prison robe for the suit of one of the members of the commission, confidently headed for the exit. Mackenzie darted between floors, giving contradictory orders. His usual composure evaporated. He understood that he was losing control of the situation. "Block all exits," he shouted into the radio, but it was too late. The fire safety system automatically unlocked some of the doors, and in the conditions of evacuation of the commission, it was impossible to completely close the prison. At some point, his eyes met with Taylor's across the entire corridor. Mackenzie saw in the inmate's eyes not fear, not triumph, but the calm confidence of a man who knows that he is doing the right thing. The warden reached for his holster, but Bob, who happened to be nearby, as if by chance pushed him, preventing him from drawing his weapon. "Sorry, sir," the warden said with feigned remorse. "Such a commotion." Ramirez, who was watching this scene, understood here it is, that very moment. He deliberately created a traffic jam in the corridor, feigning an asthma attack. While the guards were trying to drag him to the wall, a crowd of prisoners and staff formed. Taylor took advantage of this moment to mingle with the outgoing members of the commission. An hour after the start of the fire alarm, the situation in the prison began to stabilize. The prisoners were counted and taken back to their cells. Members of the commission left the building. The fire in the medical unit was extinguished, and only then did it become finally clear Taylor had disappeared. He managed to leave the prison together with the evacuating inspectors. Mackenzie raged in his office. All his plans were collapsing. The phone on the table didn't stop ringing. His informants reported that Taylor's lawyer had already handed over the documents to several major newspapers in the state. By evening, His whole world was to collapse. "Take them all," he roared into the phone. "Carson, his wife, Ramirez, everyone. I want to know who did what." But the investigation of the events of the day presented him with an unpleasant surprise. Security cameras showed only the usual commotion during the fire alarm. Bob Carson flawlessly performed his duties, trying to establish order. Emily acted strictly according to protocol in case of fire in the medical unit. Even Ramirez did nothing that could be considered a violation of the regime. Everyone played their roles so naturally that it was impossible to find fault. The next morning, a scandal erupted. Newspapers were filled with headlines about corruption in the justice system, about the rigging of evidence, about a conspiracy between the prison warden and a large businessman. The documents transferred by Taylor proved to be irrefutable. A federal investigation was launched. Mackenzie tried to flee, but was detained at the state border. A suitcase with money and forged documents was found in his car. He tried to make a deal with the investigation, promising to surrender all accomplices, but his former boss beat him to it, being the first to make a deal with the prosecutor's office. Within a week, Taylor's case was reviewed. All charges against him were dropped. New details of the corruption scheme were revealed, in which high-ranking officials and businessmen were involved. The newspapers called it the case of the decade. Ramirez received parole for assisting the investigation. He managed to see his mother, whose condition began to improve after the appearance of her son. Taylor paid for her treatment as a token of gratitude for his help. Bob and Emily Carson resigned from the correction system. After an internal investigation of their actions on the day of the escape, no claims could be made against them. Formally, they had not violated any instructions. But both understood that their time in the system was over. They moved to another city, where Emily got a job in an ordinary hospital, and Bob opened a private security agency. And somewhere on the coast, in a small coastal town, Taylor finally reunited with his children. Now they knew the truth about their father. He was not a criminal, but a man who was not afraid to go against the system for the sake of justice. Now he had to make up for the years lost in prison and build a new life, the life of a free man.